And I'm going to mute all. And again, so even though we're muted, everyone's muted. If there's something you'd like to ask, I'm not being clear about something, whatever it is, please unmute, ask. It's very important. We'd like to have the more general questions that toward the end, if there's time, and there usually isn't, so I apologize for that. Okay, in advance. I just want to frame where we're up to, because the yesterday in the synagogues around the world, we completed the second book of the Torah. Torah has 5 books. We completed the second one yesterday. We've been going this weekly journey since the beginning of the first book, with the unfolding of the generations, Hebrews, the connection with God, Abraham, Sarah, so on. The second book of the Torah was the Jews coming down into Egypt, the Passover narrative, which we're going to be celebrating in 2 weeks. And in the second half of the second book, roughly the second half, you have the Jews who have been taken out of Egypt. They are liberated from this cruel slavery. Doesn't say enough. This cruel grip of a people and a king in Pharaoh who wanted to destroy them. And then 7 weeks later, taken to a mountain and given a bunch of rules, which you get. One would assume that someone was asking, said, "This is freedom, that now I can't do this and I can't do that," and it says 365 prohibitions and 248 positives. But it was Torah is seen as a way of truly finding freedom, spiritual freedom, psychological freedom, because the human being left to his or her own devices finds their own internal slaveries, or maybe it's not so internal, but it's like, what does the neighbor think of me, or whatever it is that we're not, as if we have nothing, no political pressures, no business pressures, and we have all the money in the world and we can do whatever we want. Look at the human experiment. We find our own slaveries and we become enslaved to a bunch of different things because we're complicated human beings. And the Torah is 613 exercises to be able to achieve what we're going to call true freedom, even within the human condition, which is so full of pitfalls that doesn't allow us to be free. It allows us to be free. It makes freedom, psycho-spiritual, emotional, mental freedom, more difficult than we may think at first blush. So, with the saga, which we've mentioned several times, of the Gata Torah, Moses goes up on the mountain for 40 days, 3 times, comes down on the 10th day of Tishrei, which we know now is Yom Kippur, with the second tablets. And the day after, God gives him a mitzvah to create a tabernacle. And the tabernacle is a it's a physical place, and it's a place where the Jews can experience the true beauty and oneness with God, and the beauty that's inherent in creation, in the world, in the gold, in the silver, in everything, what we consider very earthy, very material. And there's the clarity, I guess, to go back to what we were talking about before, like an angel has. An angel has the clarity, doesn't have all the confusion and the layers of that conceal and obfuscate like we do. So they get this mitzvah of a mishkan, that's called in Hebrew. It's the tabernacle. And as Nachmanides, who's somewhat just a few years later, but a Spanish rabbi who is a contemporary of Maimonides, as he writes, he said this is really the cap to the freedom journey that we started the book of Exodus with. It's the idea of the tabernacle and finding the true spiritual freedom through the tabernacle, and the idea that we can create our own homes and our own lives into a tabernacle. That the tabernacle is very important. That later on it became the permanent holy temple, and that was really important. But what was, in a way, the most important was that we could go there and get the inspiration and the guidance, that we could go home and make our own lives out in the fields, harvesting apples and paying a mortgage, and make our lives into a tabernacle, an experience where we felt God's closeness and the meaning of life, and we're able to see through the different, to see through the haze that comes very often with being alive in a physical world. Now, to go to the history of it a little bit, to lead up to where we are now, to the book of what was known as Leviticus, and that's the third book of the Torah, and as advertised, it really is, a lot of it is about offerings. The term sacrifice gives me the creeps, so I use the term offerings, but since this is about addressing the creeps, I'll call it, for today, sacrifices, just so we can all grapple with it. What God tells Moshe, just to set this up, and some of it is actually relevant to today on the calendar. The Mishkan, the tabernacle in the desert, was a portable, collapsible, buildable structure. We're told from our history, it's not in the Torah per se, that it was done, remember, so the day after Yom Kippur, which is the 11th day of Tishrei, that's when they got the mitzvah. It took them roughly 2 months to get it done. It was ready to roll. But God told them not to actually set it up for function until later, waiting for the Passover period of time. Again, it's part of this freedom idea. And what the Torah tells us, what God told Moses is, hang on, and this first anniversary of you leaving Egypt. We left Egypt 3,333 years ago, the year 2448 on the Jewish calendar. So this was 3,332 years ago, as we were approaching the first anniversary, the first Pesach outside of Egypt, outside of that first when they flew the coop, to have to set up the Mishkan. So in the week, today is actually, today is the first day of the Hebrew month of Nisan. Today is the day we call Rosh Chodesh. It's a special day. It's a mini holiday. It's the first day of the Hebrew month of Nisan. Today is a day that 3,333 years ago, God told Moshe that you guys are going to be get out of Egypt. There's going to be this Passover offering in 2 weeks. You're going to. He lays it all out, and is when this is the time. This is actually the first mitzvah per se in the Torah happened today, 3,333 years ago, and the first mitzvah was the Jewish calendar, and it's on Rosh Chodesh, the first of Nisan, and God tells Moses, today, Rosh Chodesh, this is the framework. It's a lunar calendar. Get it? This is the new moon, and this is moving forward. So it starts off today. Now, a week in advance of this, the 23rd day of the day of the prior month, Adar, God tells Moses, and this is at the end of last week's Torah portion. We didn't get to it last week. Tells Moses to prepare for the launch of this tabernacle. And for 7 days, Moses constructs and deconstructs the tabernacle. It's a lot of work on his own, does it alone. And each day he's constructing it, and there is a service of inauguration with anointing oil. Then he collapses it. Next day, a lot of work he's doing, and he is serving really as, I guess, not I guess, I mean, what's this way it's written, kind of as the high priest at that time, and he's inducting the Kohanes, the priests, into the service, and and this is part of the induction of the tabernacle. Today, the 1st of Nisan, they began a string. There are 12 tribes of Israel. Each tribe had a chance. Their leadership would come into this new tabernacle, because starting from today, it wasn't collapsed anymore unless they were traveling in the desert. Today, it was going to stand. And today, the priests, Moses' brother Aaron as the high priest, and that family, the Kohanes, they would start to function. And one at a time, tribe by tribe, they go through the first 12 days of the month of Nisan, go through a service of inauguration, of bringing an offering, sacrifice, as part of the inauguration of this very special place of godliness. Now, that's going to show up in the Torah end of May, 4th book of the Torah. That's why the chronology is sometimes a little bit confusing here. But if we want to just get the chronological part down, they left Egypt, they got the Torah, they got the second tablets, Yom Kippur. The next day they got a mitzvah to create a mishkan, a tabernacle. The next, within the next Pesach season, 2 weeks before Pesach, is when the tabernacle kicks into function, and in time for the first out of Egypt Passover offering. And these 12 days, it is a tradition in many communities, including in Chabad, in these days, starting from today for the next 12 days, after services, we will say to ourselves, read it, and it's in the prayer book. I actually meant to bring one, if necessary, I will. In our prayer book, there's a special section for this month of Nisan, and every day we will read, it's a small section, what this particular, they all brought the same exact offering, but this particular tribe brought as an inauguration offering, because it was a holiday at the time. It was a tremendous celebration, and we still see it as a holiday, and there's certain, even in our prayers, we leave out penitential prayers in these days because it's considered a very special time. Okay. So they set up the Mishkan. The Mishkan is the Hebrew word for the tabernacle. And here, now it's going to stay, and they're going to use it. Now, what was the tabernacle for? Using our language, and I'm including myself in our, I talk about it as a place of union with God, because it was, and because we can relate to that. Now, when Maimonides writes about it in his Code of Law, and he writes differently in his Code for the Perplexed, and I just don't want to in his Guide for the Perplexed. I'm not sure how much time we're going to have. We might get into the 2 tracks of Maimonidean thought, but in case any of you ever have heard of one of the others. Maimonides writes in his laws of the temple, and the temple that stood in Israel, in Jerusalem for 830 years, 2 different temples combined, it was 830 years. It really was just a larger and permanent version of the tabernacle. He says off the bat that it is a mitzvah to create a sacred place in order to bring sacrifices. Now, the sacrifices, I think for anybody, and I'm including myself in here, with our contemporary perspective on life, sacrifices are kind of, they're not a comfort zone. And you think of sacrifices, you think it sounds very primitive. And, what did the poor animal do? And even at least in the way it was presented to me when I was in school, if you think about the Greek or the Roman sacrifices, they were about their whole thing of gods were gods are jealous of each other, fighting with each other. They're like little kids. And now, so you want to appease a God, go kill something. The whole thing made no sense to me, but this is Torah. And we believe in an infinite God, a God who doesn't is not infantile, is not jealous, and does not get is the infinite one. And even with the metaphor of what we speak about in God's interface with humanity, we always look at it and say that ultimately God is beyond all of this. So what could God see in this? And in looking at the language that the Torah uses quite a bit, Torah, the sacrifices create what the Torah calls a reach nichoach. It's a very, I would say it's quite a common phrase in the Torah. It's really specific to sacrifices, and reach nichoach means a very pleasing fragrance. Okay, I don't believe in a God who cares what kind of cologne I'm wearing or smells in a human way, but we use metaphor, we use anthropomorphism. Torah uses metaphor, and the Torah is using a metaphor as this pleasing fragrance. The language of the Torah is also, it's like my bread. In other words, it's like food, satiates God. God's not hungry. We don't talk about God who actually needs food. So there's metaphor there, but it seems that this is it's critical stuff. And in Jewish mysticism, and we'll look at the Zohar is just the basic book of Torah thought, of mystical thought. It says that the secret, in other words, that the inner soul of these services, these sacrificial services, penetrate the deepest, most mystical levels of the infinite one. So there's something really special about this. And like I say, Maimonides says off the bat, this is something, the central point of this place was to bring these offerings or sacrifices. So I want to talk about it. We have to talk about it. And this entire book really is seen, this third book is, it's even though sacrifices are they're smattering here and there, this third book takes it head on. So here's the way I think we need to, the best way to deal with it. Having put on the table that sacrifice is not something we do, sacrifice is not something you should be trying at home, and sacrifices are not something, it's certainly not my primary selling point of Jewish thought, but it's there. And if we're going to get serious, we got to look at what does it mean. So I think we have to recognize that our conceptions, our modern conceptions, they're important. They're our conceptions, but I think that I want to examine them a little bit and step out of them. It may not totally satisfy, but it just, at least rationally, to be able to get it, what does this mean? So I want to look at the place. First of all, we're using animals for these sacrifices. Because if this was just about grain, and there is a grain sacrifice or offering, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. So whatever it means. But the idea of an animal, I think for most of us, like, what do you want from the poor thing? In Torah thought, just think about, let's take a step back. Yesterday was Shabbos. Friday night, I had, like I've had for 50-something years, gefilte fish and chicken. I admit it. I ate what was once a living being. Now, I don't think of it that way. I wouldn't want to see it slaughtered, but sitting down to a meal, with the horseradish or whatever, it doesn't strike me that way. but I accept it, and it's part of Torah life. So with all respect to anybody who's a vegetarian and they don't do it, I get that, respect it, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about in a Torah thought, there is nothing wrong, and there's something actually right about what my Friday night meal was, or my Shabbos meal. In Torah thinking, while we have to be, and it's one of the 7 laws for all of humanity, we have to be careful about any cruelty to animals. And the Torah, in a period of time where the Torah frames it as not to eat a limb of a living animal. Even as a kid, I think, who would do that? Like just wrench off a limb and eat it? It sounds like that's caveman stuff. But if the Torah warns against it, this obviously people will do it. The Torah warned against it, you can't do that. But it has to be slaughtered properly. And in the Torah way, we can look and say that there's a humaneness to it. At the end of the day, it's dead. And the Torah says you can eat it. Adam was not allowed to kill for food, Adam and Eve, those generations. After the flood, Noah, the Torah says clearly you can eat from animals, not ones who died naturally. You can eat from animals. Now, that also means, I'm wearing a belt. I'm wearing leather shoes. I don't put much thought into it, but it's a part of my reality. There's the Torah scroll. Where do you think the parchment comes from? The tefillin. It's animal hide. It's not just from animals that died naturally in the animal, sanctuary. There's clearly that's permitted. So in Torah thought, just going to put this down and I'm trying to put my emotions to the side about the poor animals. In Torah thought, there is humanity is given a charge, and the charge is to engage the world and bring that world to a positive place, to a meaningful place, which means that my car, which is an inanimate object, it's a responsibility. I have to use it in a way that's positive. I'm adding to the world's quotient of positivity, and not driving somewhere to do something that would, God forbid, do the opposite. If I'm picking, harvesting wheat or picking roses, those are living things. I am not allowed to do that, to just tear off a leaf because why not? Or because I have nervous energy. That's not allowed. It's a living thing. At the same time, if I am harvesting wheat, living stalks of wheat, to create breads or whatever foodstuffs, so that we can, I, my family, my community, whoever it is, can be productive human beings in the way the Torah lays out for me, there's nothing wrong with it. Yes, I kill a stalk of wheat, but there's nothing. It's something, in a way. What I've done is I've incorporated that wheat or the roses. Let's say I bring the roses to someone to enhance the level of the flow of connectedness between us. That's okay. I shouldn't cut the rose because I have nothing to do. But if there's something positive to come out of it, it's not only okay. I've taken a rose that cannot make moral decisions, and I've used it in my positive moral decision, and I've incorporated into that equation. To use kind of funny language, I've done the rose a favor. I've elevated its existence, so now it's part of contributing to the positivity of the world. Where that may become a little bit more emotionally difficult to reconcile is that just like I've applied it to a rose or a stalk of wheat, that also applies to the animal. Now, the idea of not being cruel to animals is a Torah idea. One is not permitted to hunt for sport, period. One is not allowed to hurt or not unnecessarily kill an animal. period. If the idea is that somehow that will contribute to, the human endeavor. So I had an exterminator in my house last week, right? Well, mice are not considered somehow any less important to the world than steer or chickens. They're also alive. They're no less alive. But if them being in the house is something that is, first of all, can spread germs, it's something that it disrupts the function of the people in the house. And in my house, seeing a mouse, people see it. Believe me, it's disruptive. Less to me, but the repercussions of the seeing the mouse is just something I've got to avoid. So if it's something I don't feel guilty about it. I would, if I saw it, it would bother me. It's alive, but I have to maintain my house. Again, people can differ about that, but I think that in Torah, from a Torah perspective, I'm doing my best for it to be as humane as possible, and I need to function to be able to use the fact is that humans have moral volition, and no other living being is seen as having that. I need to function the best I can. I don't want a leaky roof. I don't want drafty windows. I don't want mice, and therefore my function to build this building, we had to knock down trees. And we were very careful about it. There was a specific tree, and we really debated whether we had to take it down. And that was very serious. It was very serious from a Torah perspective. I wasn't worried about the town. I was worried about whether it's okay. Why would we have to take down this tree? I'm not a tree hugger per se, but I don't want to kill something for no reason. But the fact that we had to clear this piece of land didn't bother me. We're building a shul. Building a house would be the same thing. So the use of animals for food is something, again, for a vegetarian, we can get into a conversation, but we're probably never going to come to a resolution because I don't have a problem with it, because I base my moral code in Torah. I don't want to see an animal killed. I don't like to think about the fact that an animal is killed when I'm eating it. And I don't. But the idea is that the Torah says it's fine for me. I would throw in also there's I don't know if the field of macrobiotics still exists. It's not my world. I was just thinking about it. It just fell into my head. But when I was in yeshiva, I knew a French gentleman. I know he's passed away. His name was a French Moroccan, Michel Abessera. And he was, at least what my friends told me, was that he was like a globally known macrobiologist guru, which meant, I believe, that he was a vegetarian. And when he became observant, he really struggled. What did you do for Shabbos? The Torah sees that there's special human satisfaction in eating meat, poultry or beef, and he would eat as part of his surrender to Torah guidance. He would eat like an ounce of chicken every Friday night. And I respected it. I remember hearing it as a student. Here's someone who was willing to had his sensibilities that weren't mine, but his sensibilities, and said, listen, this is what the Torah tells me, and this is what I'm going to do. So in that frame of mind, the idea of an animal's life being taken as part of furthering the human endeavor, it happens. Okay, whether it's belts or burgers or whatever it is, it happens in normal society, and Torah does allow for it as long as it's very carefully kept within that rubric, within that sphere. So what the Torah lays out for us is that there's a service, a way of one is walking into the tabernacle, one is walking into the temple. What's the objective? The objective is to come close to God. The objective is to come close to oneself and one's own godliness, and get centered on who we are and where we're going. And the thinking is, who does God want me to be? where and connecting with the higher presence of God. That's what the effort is about. So the Hebrew word that is translated as sacrifice, which I'm telling you, I really never use that because it does give me the creeps. I use offering for some reason. I can swallow better. I can handle better. But the idea of korban, which is the universal term, the Hebrew term, Torah term for these offerings, korban in the Hebrew, in the language, which any secular Israeli would be able to see too, it means to come close. The root of it is karov, which means close. It means a relative. It's the idea of coming close. So these offerings were coming close mechanisms. So what kind of a mechanism is it? There would be the people actually doing the offering were the priests, the Kohens. But if there was an individual bringing an offering, and there were different types. One was an atonement offering, it's just a voluntary offering, a Thanksgiving offering. That person would put their hands, and anybody could bring an offering, even non-Jews were able to bring offerings. And the person would put their hands on the animal. And it seems that there was a certain connection, like a connecting with the animal and recognizing that this living being was undergoing something for the sake of the person bringing it. This was supposed to be a spiritual journey for the person bringing the offering. And there were two very critical things. One was the leaning, it's called samicha, leaning on the offering. And then there was something that there was like a confession, a bearing of the soul. There had to be this introspective part. And then the offering was brought. Now, what does the offering symbolize? And there were different types. Generally, there were the only offerings that could be brought were oxen, sheep, goats, turtle doves, pigeons. And the Torah defines different things. We're not going to be able to drill down into details too much of that now. There's going to be enough of this coming up. Well, next week we'll do more. So in Hasidic thought, it doesn't stem from Hasidic thought, but Hasidic thought, certainly in Chabad, it expands it in a way that's meaningful to me. In the beginning of this week's Torah portion, it says, when a person wants to bring close, it's a sacrifice, it means to bring close from themselves an offering to God. So the language, the syntax is off. The from themselves doesn't exactly seem to fit in. And what our sages tell us, and Hasidic thought tells us, is that the point of the offering was to offer from ourselves something. The animal represented something, our own animal. In Jewish spiritual thought, we are seen as somewhat morally schizophrenic. That there's a part of me that when things are quiet and all things are equal, we know the right thing to do. We know the moral way to go forward in a business deal, how to treat our neighbor, how to treat our loved ones. We know what to do. And then life kicks in. And right now something upset me, or I'm off balance, or something. I know what I should do, but I really want that, whatever it is. So there's this struggle. We hope there's a struggle between our more self-serving dimension of the personality. So this is what I want. That's called the animal. An animal is morally neutral. There's no immoral animal. There's no evil animal. But an animal, by design, does what it wants. No animal can say, you know something? I'd like to pee on the carpet, but I won't do it because the house owner of the house just worked so hard to vacuum. I owe them. Doesn't happen. You want to teach an animal not to pee on the carpet, you got to give it a little swat. You got to teach it. It's Pavlovian. That's the only way. The animal knows that for their own comfort, it's better not to pee on the carpet because the price is something they don't want to pay. You cannot get, no animal ever decided to go on a diet. They just can't do that. You can shape an animal's behavior through shaping their self-interest. So that part of our behavior, the self-interest behavior, is called the animal. The higher, more visionary self that could rise above self-interest and say, no, this is what I want to do, but this is what I should do. What I want to do and what's needed of me are not often the same. That ability for vision, that's the truly human part of us, the godly part of us, the soul, the godly soul. And we see ourselves as having like different souls, also in other words, operating systems, spiritual operating systems. One more self-directed and one more visionary, other-directed, other-oriented, responsibility-oriented. So in bringing the offering, we would be the person bringing it was supposed to get into a zone of this animal representing their own animal, and that part of their lives where they're struggling, that self-centered part of life, and having that animal be swept up in the fire of godliness, and a fire is a metaphor for love, and the surge of wanting to lead a better life, of wanting to lead a meaningful life, of wanting to be able to maintain our priorities. And it was a very spiritual service. Now, in our works of the prophets, going after the Torah, you're going to find a bunch of the prophets rebuking the Jewish people and saying, you think God wants offerings? You think God wants sacrifices? Of course, they knew that that's part of the Torah. But they'll say, like Samuel rebukes King Saul and says, obeying God is much more beautiful to God than a plump offering. Don't confuse the medium for the goal. It's not about killing animals. It's about coming close to God. And this is a mechanism God gave us. Now you just think it's killing animals or somehow some holy objective. It's not. Coming close to God is. This is an avenue God gave us. So the focus and the objective is very, very critical of the Torah, and it plays out in the entire scripture. It's all about connecting more deeply with God. And really means connecting more deeply with ourselves, because we cannot connect more deeply with God until we have a better grip on ourselves, on who we are, where we're going, what our potential is, and what we think our contribution to the world is. Because everybody's got, we're alive. We've got something to contribute to the world. We're all agents for the company. We're all working for God. We all have something to contribute, and including today. And the idea is to think, okay, so what's my contribution to the world today? So, because this idea of the animal and the self-direction gets in the way, that my contribution to the world today, I wasn't thinking about a contribution to the world today. For me, I was thinking about great adventure. So there's nothing wrong with great adventure, but great adventure is it's about me having a good time. Have a good time. But what are we supposed to do? What is it? How is the world going to benefit from your good time? Good. So now you have a mental health day. Gewaldig. So what are you going to do tomorrow? Because you're in a better place mentally. That's where our mind needs to be, where we want to bring ourselves, because we want to live more closely with our North Star, with God. The korban, the offering brings us there. Now, what I'd like to do is just point out a couple of things which I think are important for our Jewish literacy, and then we can open up for questions. And unless there are no questions, I can keep on talking. But I want to point out something from. I'm going to try to share a screen again. I'm going to be daring again. I want to be able to show you something. Hang on a second. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay. I think you can. What I made a copy this morning. This bottom piece is in normal font, the very beginning of this third book of the Torah. For those who can read Hebrew, this word says Vayikra, and God called to Moses. Now, I just want to say, so what happens is, at the end of last week's Torah portion, we completed Moses completed setting up the tabernacle. A cloud of glory settles on the tabernacle. And that's the end of the second book of the Torah. And now the third book of the Torah is that God calls to Moses from within the cloud, now come into the tabernacle because I'm going to give you this service, teach you the service of bringing offerings, sacrifices. Okay, that's how the narrative is going. We finished this Shabbos morning about this idea. We've completed the tabernacle. The cloud, we did it right. How do we know we did it right? Because the cloud of glory rests on it. Baruch Hashem, we're in good shape. But now what? God calls out to Moses from the cloud. Now the word Vayikra, which is the what we call the third book of the Torah. Leviticus comes from somewhere, I don't know, definitely from the church. Some of the Septuagint, whatever it is, I don't even know what Leviticus means. It's probably something to do with the Levite, and because of the service in the temple. It's universally known as the book of Vayikra, which is the first book of this Torah. Vayikra means and God called, and the word of Vayikra, God called, means called in a way of closeness, of affection, of deep relationship. You can call someone, you can call someone. And Vayikra is called. In the center here, if you can see I don't know if you can see my cursor or whatever you call this. Vayikra, this bottom one, that's the word that's written there. This word without the aleph at the end, again, for those who know Hebrew, these are identical. The first four letters are identical. Vayikra has an aleph at the end. Vayikar does not have an aleph. We would pronounce this differently, Vayikar. It's without the aleph. This word is actually also used in the Torah to mean, and God called. But it's when God called, later on in the fourth book of the Torah, that we read about a Gentile anti-Semitic prophet named Bilam, who really was, who wanted to destroy the Jews. He's really not considered a good guy at all, but he had this prophetic skill, this prophetic talent. And when God calls him, this word is used, Vayikar. Yeah. So Vayikra, as I said, is considered an affectionate closeness calling to. Vayikar, the Hebrew word of Vayikar means the Hebrew of it, because there's no really word of Vayikar, but the Hebrew of it would mean like happenstance. Did you bump into someone? It's called a mikra. It happened. So this reflects when you're calling out to a loved one, you get yourself into a focused, grounded, meaningful place and call out with full heart. And then calling out to someone, say, "Hey, I want," you pass someone on the street. It's more of a happenstance. Since Bilam, that anti-Semitic prophet, dealt with God in a more happenstance type of way. So the way God, the Torah calling out to him is Vayikar. He called God called to Bilam as like an aside, reflecting the way Bilam was dealing with God and dealing with goodness and godliness. Vayikra means that God reached out to Moses with affection. So this bottom one is the way it appears in a book where someone needs to read, because this has vowels, and it has proper punctuation, and it has musical notes. This is the way it looks in the Torah. Torah has no vowels, Torah has no punctuation, Torah has no musical notes. But if you notice, this is the word of Vayikra right here. Vayikra has a small aleph. That's the way it appears in every Torah scroll around the world. It's an unusual thing because the font is different. This is normal size font. Very rarely there's going to be a large letter, and very rarely there's going to be a small letter. It's a rare thing. This is the way the third book of the Torah opens up. Vayikra. So it could be read, if you're looking quickly, it could be read as Vayikar, almost as the way God spoke to Bilam. But what it says is Vayikra. If this Shabbos, if I read Vayikar, I messed up the Torah reading. The word is Vayikra, but it's just a small aleph. And one of the reasons for that, because this is, you can imagine, this is analyzed quite a bit. Idea is that Moses felt here he'd been a centerpiece of building the tabernacle. He's putting up and taking down 7 days all on his own. He inducts the priests. This is really now, this is the focal point of their connection with God. And he was, because in his humility, he was saying to God, you know, I don't need you to show me this deep affection and respect in front of the people. I prefer to that we all feel more of an inequality. So the Medrash tells us that God. So in other words, Moses was saying, "Speak to me more like Vayikar." Like he ends up speaking later on to Bilam. You don't have to show me this great affection when you call me. Out of respect for his wishes, it says it with a small aleph, but the aleph is there. In other words, the Vayikra, that word. I just wanted to be able to show you how it shows in the Torah. Oops. I hope I didn't lose you. No, I didn't lose you. I just don't know how to find you. I'm sorry. Can you guys see me? I guess you can. Okay. I'll stop share. That's what it is. Okay. That is the in the first book of the first word of this book of the Torah. There is this indication of Moses' humility, God's love, Moses' humility in the expressing of God's love, and that's why there is that small aleph. I want to point out one more thing that I think is just for our own Jewish literacy. One of the things it says in this Torah portion is that in the offerings, there should not be leaven, like what we would call chametz for Passover, but all year round, there should not be leaven, nor should there be honey. Now, one of the reasons I bring it up is because the idea of honey, it's a Hebrew word, dvash, honey. And we talk about a land flowing with milk and honey, right? It shows up in the Torah quite a bit. What kind of honey is that? When I think honey, I think bee honey. And as a kid, I didn't put too much thought of it. So somehow it's flowing. Maybe there's a lot of bees in Israel. I don't know. In the Torah portion, this week's Torah portion, the primary commentary in the Torah, Rashi, makes a statement, which is not universally accepted, but he makes a statement that in biblical Hebrew, anytime the term dvash, honey, even today in Israel today, dvash means honey, means bee honey. Anytime the term dvash or honey is mentioned, it can mean bee honey, but it usually means a sweet fruit product. And that's why when the Torah later on depicts an agriculturally rich land of Israel, and it says that there's wheat and barley and there's dates and figs, and olives. So then also, and bees. It says there it's referring to rich fruits where there's this, they're oozing their sweetness, and that has the term, could be like even like a jam. The idea of honey, and the milk part is seen as that it was able to, a land that was well disposed to raising, actually it says sheep and goats, and who also give their own type of milk, and that's what it refers to. But just because it's an interesting thing, we land flowing with milk and honey, I think, is an expression just about everybody's heard. From this week's Torah portion, say it's not necessarily honey, bee honey, but it's more fruit. I'll leave it over there. It's 10:27. If there are any questions, if not, I can keep talking.
Mendy,
Yeah.
During the sacrifices, they were saying you add salt. Are they adding salt because there's part of it that has to be eaten by the Kohen, or are they adding salt for another reason? Or should I have learned this in Hebrew school?
If you had learned that in Hebrew school, I'd like to know which Hebrew school it was. That would be pretty advanced. But actually, Susan, I appreciate it, because if you were going to let me just keep talking, I was going to get to the salt. Because the salt also is an important thing for our Jewish literacy. It's okay. It's all your fault, by the way. I'm gonna launch into something else now. This idea of the offering of the sacrifice was just engaging our own self-oriented selves. We haven't had a temple, and therefore we've not brought offerings since the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era. That's a long time. And the rabbis of the Talmud tell us that our kitchen table, I would say dinner table, it's not dinner, it's where we eat, that is the altar of today. In other words, your breakfast is your service. How you deal with your food. Because when it comes to food, it's a struggle. We all like food. That's why we're designed. There's nothing wrong with liking food. But to eat like a mensch, and to not get too invested in the food, and to be able to get a grip on that very self-oriented part of ourselves, which we deal with every day. Even Yom Kippur, where you want to focus and not think about whitefish, right? There's food is critical to us. That is the offering. And whenever we have a meal, we're told to have bread on the table, salt on the table, because just like what the Torah says in this week's Torah portion, and as you said correctly, Susan, is never lack salt on the altar. There always had to be salt on the altar, and salt as part of the offering. Now, why salt? Good question. Well, there's a lot of different. And by the way, that's why we take bread. We dip it into salt, because bread means you're having a meal. That's a Torah meal. There's bread. The definition of a meal is bread, and you dip it into salt to recognize, because we're having an offering. It's the meal is our offering. One of the simplest ways of going through about the salt, and I didn't get into it. I didn't really get into the symbolism of the leaven or the honey either, but is that the offerings were meant to encompass all of reality. So there was the animal world, there were meal offerings, which is more of the vegetative, and the salt was from the core inanimate of the earth. That everything we're bringing. Our job is to use every element of creation as part of our meaningful life and elevating it. It's probably the simplest way. There's a lot of different ways in, but that's probably the easiest way to go. Yes, Barbara. You're muted.
Maybe this is a silly question, but
No such thing. No such thing.
Well, sometimes I like to think a little bit more before I ask it, but it was concerned, I was thinking about it. Where the ideal diet is supposed to be plants, right? The vegetables. When we return to paradise, that's what we will be eating. We will no longer be killing animals to eat. Is that correct?
No.
No.
Did I just blow a hole in your, no,
No, that's what I thought.
no, there's no, there are, I would say there are opinions that in the times of Mashiach, there will be, like by Adam and Eve, it will be vegetarian, but that's not universal at all.
Okay, well, the point is, there's a thought out there about it, so I'm going to go off that thought.
Go for it.
So the next question is why aren't plants given the same type of a height then in a sacrificial way? I mean, it's life. Given that same, because by honoring the meat, the connotation doesn't mean, connotation could be that plants don't carry that same
There are meal
weight.
offerings. There are meal offerings, and every day there were chals. Those are the showbreads. So the grains were very well represented in the service of the temple.
As offerings.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, because I haven't read that. What's the Hebrew wording for the sacrifice?
Read this week's Torah portion. You can't miss it.
Okay, all right.
That's it. Okay. See you next week. Maybe we'll get into more details of this very
Take care, Rabbi.
interesting subject. Yes, we will. Bye-bye.